Why play Black Rose? Well, you want a flexible AP comp that gives you multiple options for carries. You want a comp that is easier to stabilize than some others because of your many options. You want a comp that is not relatively expensive, so you have a low early game cost. Or you have a really good spot for Dominators, because Dominators fits really well with the Black Rose core. However, Black Rose units are often contested. The frontline units themselves are very popular amongst many different types of AP as well as AD comps. As a result, it's not always a firstable comp, it's very consistent, but in order to get a first, a lot of times it becomes expensive to cap. Additionally, when you're playing Black Rose in a very difficult lobby, it requires strong flex play. You have to be able to identify very quickly what your stabilization points are and how you can stabilize your board based on different units in order to preserve your HP and get to a point where you're actually winning out. Now, just as the general intro, please make sure to like and subscribe if you do like my content. If you've been watching more than one video, 90% of you aren't subscribed. It really helped me if you subscribe to my channel because I'm still a small creator and everything helps out for me. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go through the actual traits. So what is Black Rose? So a lot of people have probably already seen it, but I did get asked to do this, or this was one of the recommendations of something to do. So I'm going to be talking about Black Rose and try and lean it a little bit more towards Black Rose Dominators, which is a very common comp right now. Black Rose was the dominant comp in the first patch, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen it before. It has fallen off a little bit, but it's still quite popular. The way Black Rose works is it's the dedicated summon trait for the set. In the set, there's usually a trait where you put them in and they spawn some extra unit, and that unit is either a frontline or a backline unit and has some extra effects and etc. With Black Rose in particular, it's active at 3, 4, 5, and 7. 7 requires 2 emblems, and 5 you can hit by just playing all 5 Black Rose units. So what it does is summons a chain scion, and then after Black Rose units cast, or if he drops below a certain amount of health, he then runs forward, and the scion runs around and he basically can stun. He works as a really strong frontline unit. When you increase the amount of Black Rose units that you're playing, for example 4 and 5 Black Rose, what ends up happening is the scion becomes a little bit more strong. You can see that he grows a little bit when you're playing him on the field, and then enemies basically take more damage from Black Rose units at 4, which isn't super important, but in high cap situations it might matter. And then 5, the Scion basically re-heals back to full. So if you use Scion as a frontline unit, when he's chained up, he can absorb damage. When he is unleashed from his chains, he will then heal back that damage. He'll heal back to full. So he's very good. This trait is very strong as just playing to get an extra frontline unit, basically. That's the way you should look at it, is you're trying to play this core to build around it, and you have this extra Scion that you then have as an additional frontline unit. So it's very strong early game because you basically have a +1 unit. It's quite strong in your mid game depending on if you can stabilize around units to build an actual board. And then late game, you basically have an extra frontline unit. So especially if people don't have AoE damage, you can cap out very high, and you can be pretty overwhelming if you already have other frontline units in addition to the Scion. So one thing that I wanted to introduce here, I don't know if I'm going to make a separate guide on Dominators, but we're going to talk a lot about Dominators today, so I want to also show you Dominators. Dominators is a really good pairing because if you notice, there is the Cassiopeia, the little one with the blue icon. She has like white hair, blue border around her. Cassiopeia exists as both a Black Rose unit and a Dominator because she shares the synergy with both of these traits. A lot of times, because you're playing around AP, typically when you're playing Black Rose, you could put these two together very nicely because there is that point where she's shared across both traits of Black Rose and Dominator. So when you're playing Dominators, the way Dominators work is they gain a shield, and then while they cast, based on the mana that they spent, they gain AP, or they gain ability power. So typically, you can see Ziggs, Blitzcrank, Mundo as a frontline unit, Silco is the main carry, and a lot of times when you're playing around Black Rose, you're playing with a Silco carry, and then Mordekaiser is really good for capping out your board. And when you play Dominators, they basically get a bunch of AP. It synergizes very well with Black Rose because conceptually, Black Rose gives you more frontline. It makes your board a little bit tankier, harder to get to the backline units. If you have a unit like Silco on your backline, who as they cast more and more, they gain more AP, it helps the backline units to scale really well with Dominator. So it synergizes very well the two traits, and that's why a lot of times, in addition to sharing the Cassiopeia that exists between both of the traits, a lot of times they pair really nicely because of exactly the reason of scaling up the backline units and getting a bunch of damage on board. So When should you play Black Rose? Black Rose doesn't really have that many conditions. I'm going to be honest with everybody. It is very flexible. A lot of times if you just have AP items or a really good augment that like promotes flexible play, a lot of times that's all you really need. Sometimes if you have a good econ, a lot of times if you're uncontested and you can just play Black Rose, it's a really good default comp to go to. A lot of people end up defaulting this when they're playing AP, but you should always keep in mind that you can flex between Black Rose and other AP lines that might be a little bit easier to cap if you're in particular spots. I bring up Bronze for Life here because Bronze for Life is one of the really high cap versions of playing Black Rose, which we will talk about later when we go through some of the boards. Additionally, if you look at the AP items that I'm showing stuff that gives you attack speed, damage amp, and crit chance. A lot of times when you're playing around Dominators, because they get so much AP from their Dominator trait, you want to pair that with crit chance, attack speed to help them cast, or to do more damage with critting with all the AP that they have, or damage amp for the same reason. A lot of times like you don't need to make like an Archangels or stuff like that. So, you know, we'll talk about it a bit later, but like if you start the game off and you have like a Jewel Gauntlet, Gnasher's Tooth, you might be leaning more towards playing Silco, and then you play Black Rose with the Dominators in order to cap that board out. So let's go through some late game boards. Before we do so, we're just going to talk about the trait itself. So these are the Black Rose units. Now, conceptually, when you're looking at Black Rose units, I always say that it's a very flexible comp. The reason it's very flexible is because there are a lot of options. You don't have to look very hard. But if you look at the units themselves, so you have frontline and backline units. Basically, the 2-cost, Vladimir, he's Warden, Sorcerer, and Black Rose. You have Elise, who is Form Swapper, Black Rose, and Bruiser. You have Morgana, who is Visionary and Black Rose. And then you have Cassiopeia, who's Black Rose Dominator. And then you have LeBlanc, which is the 5-cost, the Legendary unit, which is Black Rose with Sorcerer. Inside the actual trait of Black Rose, of the 5 units, you can get to 5 Black Rose by just playing all the Black Rose units. There are 2 Sorcerers, so you get the Inter-Sorcerer synergy that your whole team gains 10 AP, even if you activate it. Additionally, if you look at the traits, you'll notice that there is Bruiser, Dominator, Form Swapper, Visionary, Watcher. If we think about all of the backline traits, backline carries that you can have that are AP carries, the AP carries usually fall into one category of their synergies. They either are a Visionary, like Malzahar and Heimerdinger, they are a Sorcerer, like Zoe, for example, or they are a Dominator, like Silco. So because of Black Rose's synergies, it synergizes with all of the backline AP traits, or the more generalized AP traits. Other AP traits that you might look at is something like Form Swapper if you're playing like back row, Swain, for example. Form Swapper is pretty important. But as you can see, with Black Rose, you synergize with Form Swapper, you synergize with Sorcerer, you synergize with Dominator, you synergize with Visionary. That's why it's very flexible. It's made and it's designed in a really cool way, this set, where you're making a core that you can interchange the backline units fairly easily. Now, of course, there is max cap, like, you know, theory crafting, and people have tried it out. You know, some units are obviously better than others. That's why a lot of times people end up just playing Silco with Black Rose. However, I do want to stress, like, especially if you're somebody who's trying to climb the ladder and boards aren't hyper optimized at the elo that you're in, then you do have lots of options. And I think that in future patches it will become more along the lines of giving you multiple options, because that's the design of the trait. Additionally, it's synergized with Bruiser, Dominator, Form Swapper, and Watcher. Basically all of the frontline traits you can synergize with Bruiser. So for example, let's say you're playing around, well, let's say Dominator frontline, you have Mundo that you can play as a frontline unit with Dominator. Form Swappers, you can play them as frontline or backline units because of the Elise. Other Bruisers, for example, you can play Bruisers because of the Elise in this situation. And Watcher, a lot of times you'll see that Garen is one of the go-to units that you play with Black Rose, because Garen is just a really strong frontline unit and you get Watcher in for free. The only frontline trait that Black Rose doesn't synergize with is Sentinel. But other than that, you basically have a very flexible core that can fit with both frontline as well as backline units. That's why it's often very nice to play around these units, because even if you don't hit Elise and LeBlanc, you still activate 3 Black Rose with a fairly inexpensive board, and then you get a free Scion as a frontline unit for just playing stuff that you would normally play just to synergize, to get those synergies on your carries and on your main tanks, which is very, very nice. Now let's go through the main board that you normally would see being played. This is a nice little reliable level 8 board. A lot of times on level 8, you're just going to be playing 4 Black Rose and 4 Dominator if you're playing around Silco. So let's go through every single unit here and we'll talk about items. So I'm going to be incorporating Dominators with Black Rose a lot in this discussion, just because it's the go-to, but we'll also show you some other flex options in a little bit. So Silco, Silco, you always want to make Shojin Nashers. Almost always. It's not like, you can make other items for sure. Like Nashers, you can replace with other attack speed items so long as they give a bunch of attack speed. But typically, you want to make Shojin Nashers. You just want him to cast a bunch. The Dominator trait relies on Silco casting a bunch to scale into the fight. So you want to make sure that you have something that gives you both mana as well as a bunch of attack speed. It generally is pretty good on Silco. And the last item, you just want to have something that's not like an Archangel's. Archangel's is fine. Like, don't get me wrong. If you have Archangel on Silco, it's not like you're going 8th. It's not like anti-synergy. It's a little bit, like I talked about a lot in the item guides, it's a little bit of diminishing returns because you already gain so much AP from the Dominator trait if you actually scale up Dominators that you'd rather just put a damage item that gives him some other finesse, right? There's different builds you can go for Silco, but a lot of times the common one just for item economy, which means just like, making sure that you're using different components when you're making the items, is Jewel Gauntlet. Jewel Gauntlet works really well on him because you're basically allowing him to crit off of the massive amount of AP that he has. So a lot of times you'll see something like Nashers, Shojin, Jewel Gauntlet. If you see, like, you'll see people play towards Silco by just seeing that they have a Jewel Gauntlet. It's pretty good. I'm not gonna lie, it's not the highest cap version. There's often very specific variations of this that you can do, but this is like a go-to. You just make these 3 items and then you can figure out what you do later. With Dominators especially, if you hit the higher levels of Dominator, like 4 Dominator, and later we'll talk about 6 Dominator, sometimes I've seen people build double Shojin Nashers on Silco. Basically, instead of making a 3rd damage item, you're just trying to make this guy cast so much faster that you instead just scale up your Dominator trait to a point where Silco's doing an insane amount of damage because he gains all of the AP. This is something that's more common with 6 Dominator, if I'm not mistaken, so I wouldn't recommend just building towards it, but it's more like, if you get stuck with a bunch of extra swords and tiers and you don't know what to make, this is an opportunity. That is an option that you can put on Silco. Additionally, you can put damage amp items like Guard Breaker and what's it called? Giant Slayer, but that's just how it is. When you're looking at LeBlanc a lot of times ends up being a backline unit. If you don't have LeBlanc early, a lot of times you're playing towards Morgana. But we're just going to put LeBlanc here just for the sake of example. Usually you put your utility items on LeBlanc. LeBlanc does do a lot of damage, but a good portion of her damage is she sends out the Black Rose chain things that she does. And basically she splits the damage between different units, and based on the amount of damage that they take, it kind of amplifies that as true damage to the others. So LeBlanc herself doesn't necessarily have to be the one doing the damage. Just by her casting, she kind of has like a damage amp effect for the other units of your board. Of course, she also does her own base kit damage, so if you have a LeBlanc 2, you could itemize her, but generally, you typically put like utility items on her because she spreads really well, because she hits multiple units in her cast in itself. So a lot of times you're putting like your Shivs, your your Morellos, or your red buffs, right? Like anti-heal, shred, stuff like that is typically what you put on LeBlanc. Now, let's go through Frontline. So to the Frontline, you have many options for Frontline. A lot of times, the main Frontline unit that you're trying to go for is Garen. However, if you end up with a Mundo or an Elise, you can play around the Mundo and Elise pretty easily. It's not that big of a deal. Whenever you're playing around Garen, you always want to put HP items on Garen, just because he gives the HP buff because of his Emissary trait. If you read his Emissary trait, basically for Garen has allies to left and right, gain 12% of his max health. So if you stack a bunch of HP on him, will give HP. Normally you position him as such, where you take your secondary tank and you take your Scion, and then Garen gives HP to the Scion and the secondary tank. So basically, just with a Garen alone, no matter whichever one you hit between Mundo and Elise, you then pass on the HP between these 3 units. Usually you put Scion on the edge because it's just easier for him to get targeted by an enemy carry. So a lot of times, like, if we're going full board, for example, let's say the enemy carry is like, I don't know, Twitch, right? A lot of times you put Scion on the same side as the Twitch because the Twitch is going to target this guy first because he's closest a lot of the time. Then the Scion will pop out of the chains. He'll dash forward, right? And then if he dashes forward, I can't make him go on the other side. He'll stun the Twitch a lot of the time, something like that, right? So typically you just position in such a way where your Scion's getting aggroed first, he pops out, he stuns the enemies, you get the stun off early, which helps you a lot of the time, especially if they're a ramping team comp. Besides Warmogs, a lot of times you can put Frontline utility on Garen. Something like a Sunfire Cape is really nice because it also gives some HP as well. Additionally, if you don't have utility, You can build him with full tank items, right? Belt items help out a lot because of his emissary trait, but otherwise you could put armor and MR based on what your lobby is going. Mundo has a very similar build, whoever your main tank is. If you have a Mundo 2, you can play around the Mundo 2. And then less common, because Elise isn't as tanky until like late game if you get Form Swapper in and Bruiser in. A lot of times you don't have the synergies to make Elise super strong, but if you had an Elise 2, you can also play around the Elise as your main tank if you only have like a Garen 1. And then you can always rearrange items later. But typically you're trying to prioritize belt items or HP items on the frontline units. Armor and MR also helps a lot, so by all means, make sure to build your armor and MR. If you have something like a Gargoyle, or if you have things like Bramble Declaw, these are all really important because they help out a lot against the opponents that you will face. So, if we're talking about max cap, how you cap this board a little bit higher, a lot of times you basically just go for Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser, in terms of items, you almost always want to have a QSS on Mordekaiser. I want to recommend building a QSS early with this comp because you don't get much value out of it besides putting on Mordekaiser. But basically the way Mordekaiser works is a Dominator. He is a Dominator, excuse me, but the way he works is he has like a little 10-second window that once he casts, he basically goes like nuts. He gains increased attack range, and then he slams his hammer down repeatedly. I'm sure you've seen it if you played the game even like a couple times. It's very cool. It's very strong. Basically, you want to uninterrupted attack as fast as possible during the small window basically during the small window you want to attack as much as possible, excuse me. And what you want to do is you want to give him a bunch of attack speed, something like QSS where he can't be stunned and he gets a bunch of attack speed. Things like a Nashor's Tooth is really good, and then a damage item. He has Omnivamp built in, so you don't have to build Omnivamp. You could put stuff like Edge of Night and melee items on him. It's totally fine. But typically you just want him to like attack as fast as possible, swing the hammer, and just absolutely like rail the opponent. When you're capping out this board, additionally, this is a level 9 board. Jace is very strong because it gives Elise a lot of tankiness. More important than Bruiser a lot of the time is getting Form Swapper on her because you get so much durability from just 2 Form Swapper, right? You get like what? 15% durability, which is probably a lot better than just like having a little bit of extra HP with Bruiser. So a lot of times Form Swapper is really good. Jace you can cap very high if you have AD items, because a lot of times if you're making AP items, eventually you're going to be left over components that can make AD items. Jace is a good outlet for those AD items. If you notice, this is one of the more max cap, like, strong boards that you can play. I'm not really mentioning going into 5 Black Rose. A lot of times 5 Black Rose as well as 6 Dominator is a little bit bait. It is situationally quite good. Don't get me wrong. 6 Dominator does slap and 5 Black Rose does slap. But you don't really need it, right? If you make it to this level and you have enough damage, the extra HP and the extra tankiness on the Scion from 5 Black Rose isn't that important. Additionally, you're just going to be wasting a spot on your board playing a Morgana, which is a 1-cost unit. Like, you kind of don't need it. You don't really need the synergy of Visionary for anybody here. So a lot of times it's not worth it to play 4 Black Rose. It's not worth it to play 5 Black Rose. You can just play 4 Black Rose. In some situations as well, you might even want to drop to even lower levels of Black Rose, like 3 Black Rose, because just the Scion is enough to just like stun and do a little bit of extra work for your team. But it's much better to cap out around legendary units. That's what I was saying before. Well, this comp, you know, you have a lot of options and you're pretty flexible in making a board on level 8. When you cap it on level 9, you know, if you go 9 and you don't have a lot of gold and you just play 5 Black Rose, that's totally fine. But in order to actually cap out the board pretty high, you typically want to play around the legendary units. Hitting a Mordekaiser 2, for example, in this type of setup is usually game winning. Jace 2, Mordekaiser 2, you're pretty much guaranteed to win. LeBlanc 2 isn't that important, but she's quite good if you have a LeBlanc 2 as well. Additionally, just for the people that really like the left side of the screen to light up, you could drop to 3 Black Rose and play 6 Dominator as well. 6 Dominator, you basically just have to play Ziggs and Blitzcrank. These units are pretty useless, but in certain circumstances, like if you have like crit build, for example, and you're like all your damage is in your Mundo, or sorry, you have like Mundo main tank and all your damage is in your Silco, you might want to just play around the Dominator trait because it helps both of them, especially if you have a Mordekaiser already. Sometimes this works out really nicely instead of playing like a LeBlanc 1 and trying to synergize with other stuff. If you don't have the means to make a board this strong, you can instead just play around 6 Dominator, which is very, very reliable. It's very strong. But it's a little bit more like contingent on just like, you know, you need like, you know, Garen 2, you probably need Elise 2 because you're frontline. You're probably playing around Mundo as your main tank, so you have to have really good Mundo items, which, you know, you want like AP as well as like HP is a little bit less tanky than Garen, so but your Garen items can work really well on Mundo. And then like you want really good Mordekaiser items as well. in this case, because Mordekaiser now is going to be like part of your front line because you're playing like a lot of like these weaker units, so you're lacking damage. So you really want everything to be a lot more perfect, I would say. Also, I think in this build, like double Shojin on Silco is pretty cool. So if you're in a spot where you're stuck with double Shojin, this might be a little bit of a better situation for that. I think in the stats it does say that it's pretty good, but I think it's tied to 6 Dominator last time I checked. Additionally, this is also really good if you high roll yourself into a Ziggs 3. We'll talk about it a bit later, but Ziggs is very strong, and a lot of times a really strong opener you can play around Ziggs from your early game to your mid game. In a lot of these boards, I'm not showing Ziggs on the board. Ziggs can very easily fit into a lot of these boards for extra damage. Like instead of like, you know, this board on level 8, instead of playing a random Blitzcrank, if you already have an upgraded Ziggs, a Ziggs 2 does way more damage than a Silco 1, right? Like a Silco 1 versus a Ziggs 2, a lot of times it's correct to put the items on a Ziggs 2. Once you have a Silco 2, it is better to put the items on the Silco because Ziggs is just a little bit too slow a lot of times in doing damage, and he also has a randomness to his to the way that he deals the damage. But Ziggs 2 it's a great secondary carry in a lot of these situations, so don't sleep on Ziggs. Additionally, if you like have it, like, you know, maybe you're like worth the wait Ziggs, or you high roll it in your mid game, a lot of times you can actually like cap out your board really high around Ziggs 3 in addition to Silco 2. This Ziggs will he fucks. He will do really good late game. So make sure to keep that in mind. Now, besides our late game options, I want to talk about some flex options. So something that's really important, I've been talking a lot about flex. We are focusing on Dominator because that is the highest cap version. It's the one that's more reliable that people tend to play towards nowadays. So I don't want to be disingenuous and just say, play anything. TFT is fun and interesting. It's like, no, I want to be like realistic, and I want to give you guys the best opportunity to climb and rank up. So typically when you play Black Rose, you normally play with Dominators. However, a big portion of Black Rose is you want to be very flexible. You want to eventually get to a point where I showed you, where you're playing Jace and Mordekaiser and Silco and you're capping out around those 3 units. However, the journey to get there can sometimes be a little bit difficult. What you should always notice is that there's multiple options to have for frontline and backline units that we were alluding to from the beginning. When you're looking at the units that we're showing in general, like the ones that I already showed you on the board, Garen can be a frontline unit, Elise can be a frontline unit, and Mundo can be a frontline unit. So depending on what you hit when you roll down 2-star, whatever you hit as a 2-star unit, you can stabilize around those units. Additionally, if you don't hit any of these units, there's lots of other units you can pick up along the way in order to make some interesting frontline boards. Something like because you're playing Form Swapper a lot of times with Elise, something like a Swain 2 can be a really good frontline option. Something like a Nunu and Willem that gives you Bruiser can be a really good frontline option around the Elise. You're usually playing the Vlad, which gives you Watcher, but even playing other Watcher units can help you out quite well. So you're looking for other frontline options is also a thing. Additionally, Sentinels don't really fit into the board really nicely, but you can always drop out of some of the useless Dominator units. For example, if you don't hit a Mundo and you don't want to play Ziggs, you can just drop down to 2 Dominator, and instead you can beef up your front line by playing like an Alawi or a Rumble or a Rel. Rolling down with this comp is very interesting and fun, and a lot of times, like even when I play Black Rose, when I play Black Rose Dominators, I've played it since the beta, and I always said this was my favorite comp because I just like to play around it all the time. The reason I love it so much is because even when I mess up, or even when something goes wrong with this comp, I always feel like it's my fault. When I VOD review, I always see options like, oh, I rolled past a lot of Alawis. If I made an Alawi 2-star, I could have stabilized around Alawi 2 this game. If I made a Swain 2, I could have stabilized around Swain 2 this game. There's lots of frontline options that you can just interchange, kind of like Lego pieces. Once you have the 3 Black Rose, don't worry too much about everything being perfect, like 4 Dom, everything. A lot of times in TFT, you want to just stabilize your mid game to a point where you feel comfortable enough to carry on afterwards. You can always pivot afterwards, right? Like if you have a Swain 2, I'm not saying you have to finish the game with Swain 2. If you have an Alawi 2, I'm not saying you have to finish the game with the Alawi 2. It's more so like keep your options open, look at your items, and when you're rolling down, pay attention to the units that you're picking up and what you're seeing in your shops. Because if you see like an Alawi pair in your shop, it might be better for a couple turns to just play Alawi, maybe upgrade Alawi 2, and then stabilize around that. Additionally, with your backline units, there's lots of options for backline carries. We're talking about Dominators with Silco a lot. Visionary also synergizes. If you find an early Malzahar and Heimer, this used to be, it's something that's dramatically nerfed. I'm not saying that you're going to win the game playing Heimer with Black Rose. That's not a meta comp anymore because they nerfed pretty much every aspect of it. It used to be meta last patch, and they literally nerfed, I genuinely mean, they literally nerfed every aspect of this. So I'm not saying to play an inferior comp. What I'm saying is, if you see a bunch of Heimers, you could stabilize around it, and then once you reevaluate how the rest of the game is going and whether or not you're contested and if you can make it to level 9, you can sell the Heimer later and just put the items on a Silco later. It's like, it's fine, right? The same with Malzahar, right? I played a game today where I stabilized around a Malzahar 2. I ended up not winning the game because there was a Nocturne reroller in the lobby, which just sucked, but you can still stabilize around some of these units. Zoe as well, stabilize around sorcerers. Form swappers, if you hit an early Jace, you don't even need to worry about having your AP items on like Silco and those type of units. You can play something like Jace with Elise and just play around form swappers with the same core. Here's some examples of stuff that I'm talking about. If you find an early Malzahar, for example, you get 2 Visionary in for free. You get Automata in for free with Dominators with Blitzcrank. You can play Black Rose, 3 of them, which will synergize for your frontline a little bit. And then you could stabilize around your items on a Malzahar. You don't have to commit to the Malzahar being your final carry, but you can flexibly fit him in just to get some damage in your mid game. Additionally, I'll talk about that one later. Let's talk about Sorks. So this is what I was saying with Alawi, for example. Sometimes, you know, a lot of people don't play Rebels because they're a little bit weaker. You can stabilize pretty well around Sorcerers with Zoe and Black Rose. Now, this isn't a strong comp. You're not going to get like a guaranteed top 4. I'm not saying this is really good, but what I'm saying is, if you find that you roll down and you don't hit, you don't have to like put items on nobody, right? You can put items on Zoe for a couple turns, put tank items on Alawi for a couple turns, and then if you're able to eventually find your Garens, find your Elises, and reevaluate your board, you can then fix up everything after. Swain is surprisingly very strong, especially with Form Swapper and Sorcerer in. So Swain 2 can even stabilize you and carry, and sometimes you can go a fast 9 off of a Swain 2 with a Black Rose setup similar to this. There's many options. You should always consider them. Another thing that you should also look at is Black Rose whenever you see something like, what's it called? Bronze for Life, right? Bronze for Life is one of the strongest traits to play around because it gives you so much damage amp. The way Bronze for Life works, it's an augment, and it gives you damage amp for every single bronze trait that you have activated. Black Rose because it synergizes with so many different boards. A lot of times you can just fit in a really strong Bronze for Life board. Silco and Dominators get so much damage amp in addition to just like playing the game. They get so much damage amp from just like stalling out the fight. So if you have a really strong front line, if you give damage amp as well as a bunch of AP, sorry, I think I didn't explain that well. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that Bronze for Life works really well with Silco because Silco has a bunch of AP, and if you stack a bunch of damage amp on the Silco, especially Silco and Mordekaiser, if you get to Mordekaiser, they just absolutely delete the board. This is like a game-winning position. If you have Bronze for Life, this is a common way to play Bronze for Life, because basically what you do is you put Black Rose in, you put Garen in, he's Emissary, he gives you 2 traits, you put in this dude, which is Swain, he gives you Sorcerer, and Form Swapper, and then everything just synergizes. And then you just put in a Bruiser, put in a dude. Look at how many Bronze for Life value I get. It's so easy with Black Rose. There's so many different options as well. You can put in a Rennie, just get Bruiser and Chem Baron in. You can put in like a Jace, and you just play more Form Swappers. Like, there's so many ways to cap out this type of board. This is like a level 8 board, right? Like, it's not even close to being capped. A lot of times, if you see Bronze for Life and you're already in a spot where you can play Silco, it's like an instant click and it's like a win out spot a lot of the time. So if you're looking for a flexible option and you're trying to play something like Bronze for Life or things like that, you usually play or lean towards something like this. Early game boards. So in terms of early game boards, a lot of times any AP early game is good. It leaves your options open if you just make general AP items without focusing too much on like what the perfect Silco items are, what the perfect X unit items are. A lot of times you can flex pretty easily between Zoe, Heimer, and Silco, even if it takes you 1 or 2 turns. So for example, like this Sorcerer board that I showed you, you can still pivot this to a Rebel board, right? Like if you find a Jinx on a carousel, for example, you can sell some of these units and just pivot to like full Zoe Rebel board. The same way with like a Malzahar or like a Heimerdinger. You can find ways to like change the board into the one that you want to play later in the game. Like if you wanted to play Academy, if you wanted to play Zoe. So you should leave your options open. So a lot of times that's why I always recommend making items like Shojin Nashers, because they're generally pretty good on AP units. It's like the go-to AP option if you're like looking for generic AP items to make. But early game, depending on whatever you get, a lot of times any AP opener can lean itself very well into the Black Rose board. You don't need Black Rose units to start, because it's more of like a mid to late game board, because you need a Cassiopeia, right? Cassiopeia, she's a 3 cost, so you don't have to have a Cassiopeia to play Black Rose. A lot of times you just put her in later. But typically what you're going to do is you're going to play around like a Vex with a Morgana. You get Visionary in your backline, or you can play Lux with Zyra. And then one of these are going to be your item holders for much of your early game into your late game. Starting the board out with Sentinels is pretty good. If you just start it with Watchers, that's also fine. Pretty much anything is okay. As long as you have AP items, you can maybe consider playing around Black Rose. Something that's a little bit more forcing and a little bit more interesting to play is when you actually have a really strong Dominator opening. Pyromaniac with Ziggs is absurd. Ziggs got buffed a lot this patch. The problem with Ziggs is that like it's hard to reroll because he's the only 2-cost Dominator unit, and there's not other 2-cost scrap units either, so there's not like a good reroll board you can play with Ziggs. But a lot of times if you find a Ziggs 2-star, or even if you make it to Ziggs 3-star, you can cap out your board really high playing around the Ziggs and just playing vertical Dominator with that Ziggs, right? That is to say, if you start the game off and you have something like Pyromania, Pyromania with a Ziggs opener is like you pretty much 100 streak the whole game. It's so strong. You can play early game boards like this where you play like Scrap, Bruiser, Dominator, and then you can like pivot that board later in the game. It's not something that you have to commit to, but it's something that's a little bit more indicative of a Black Rose spot. Now let's go back to the last part. So conditions for success. So one thing that's really important is you have to be good under pressure. It's very easy to stabilize. I just threw a bunch of info at you, like a lot of different boards, a lot of different ways to stabilize, a lot of different, like me saying you can play flexibly. It is easy to stabilize because you have the extra frontline unit. That's the main thing, right? Because you just boom spawn a Scion in front of your board. A lot of times, like, you don't have to worry about, like, your frontline upgrades don't have to be perfect. Your backline upgrades don't have to be perfect. You basically have an extra unit on your board, which is very, very nice. It helps you to stabilize pretty easily. However, if you're very tunnel vision, like, I need Silco, I need Garen, I need these items on these units, this is what I want to do because the guide said so. I don't want to structure a guide like that, but you have to try and be as open as you can when you're playing these type of boards. However, if you do end up tunnel visioning, it does become very hard. At the same time, there also is the challenge of like not being tunnel vision and like not getting too dizzy, like buying too many units and then your bench is full and then you don't know what to sell. So it requires you to be good under pressure to a certain degree. I wouldn't say it's hard. By all means, it's pretty okay, especially if you're uncontested, you can just play towards it. But whenever you have to deal with these flexible traits, you have to be a little bit more cautious when you're doing your roll downs. Additionally, if you have AP openers and really good items, I was already mentioning stuff like crit items and damage amp items are really good if you're trying to play towards Dominators. So those type of AP items are absolutely great. Attack speed is also good. You have many options with Ornn artifacts as well, because there's a lot that give you attack speed and or give you like frontline tankiness. So that's all good. So you're very flexible a lot of times when you're playing around Black Rose. You want to be relatively uncontested, right? Like having a Garen and Elise is pretty good. Garen and Elise are very commonly bought even amongst other boards, right? There's lots of AD as well as AP comms where they will buy both Garen and Elise. Elise, being the 4-cost bruiser, is bought all the time for pretty much everything. Garen as well is bought all the time for pretty much everything. He's played on AD comms like Emissary. He's played on AD comms like Snipers. He's played on AP comms. Like, these units are hard to find, so you have to be pretty careful about playing it, because sometimes you just don't have the front line. Now, with Black Rose, you do get the extra Scion, so it's not usually an issue, but sometimes you just bleed out because you can't find a Garen because they're all gone, or you can't find an Elise because they're all gone, and then things go really poorly after that point. Additionally, you want to have good econ for multiple carries in level 9. When you're trying to cap out the board, I think like one of the go-to cap options is this. Also, while I'm here, I also want to say don't get baited by Black Rose Emblem. A lot of times Black Rose Emblem isn't that good, especially if it's an augment. If you get it for free, it's fine. But if you get it as an augment, 5 Black Rose isn't that important. Even 4 Black Rose isn't that important a lot of the time, because the sign is just tankiness that's not doing a bunch of damage. So he's not gonna carry your board if you hit 5 Black Rose, or if you hit anything like that, I wouldn't worry too much about it. However, what I would worry about more is just making sure that your other units that are actually doing damage are strong, and then capping out your board around 5 costs, right? It's not worth it to play low cost Black Rose units if you can cap out your board around 5 costs. That's really, really important. And that's why I mentioned here, you want to have good econ to go level 9 and to itemize multiple carries. If you can itemize towards both Mordekaiser as well as Silco, you usually can win the game off of these comps, right? It is Dominator focus, which is why I said we're talking about Dominators a lot. But if you're playing Black Rose and you're itemizing these 2 units, you're in a very good spot. If you're in some kind of ragtag board where you're not playing around Dominators, a lot of times it doesn't spark joy. I don't think you're going to get like the easiest top 4 of your life. And I wouldn't recommend doing this as a game plan. This is like a good plan B to play for a 4th. And then if you high roll later, you can then fix your board later. So for example, if you can stabilize like this, you don't lose too much HP, you try and make it work. And then eventually you can sell these units and pivot over to Dominators, which might work out a little bit better. And then you're a lot stronger. That's what I usually recommend. So I'm not saying like, you know, I'm not saying to do it all the time. It's like a sometimes food if you play like that. So those are all the conditions. Example gameplay. I had a lot of videos that I was going to show you, but I didn't want to show all of them because I think that this isn't that important. So we're just going to go right here on my account. And I think I have a cool Black Rose game that you can check out. It's a 7 Black Rose game, which is very high roll, right? So you can check out this VOD. I didn't want to go through it because I don't have a VOD ready right now because I just play this comp a lot offline. And it was very meta last patch, so I feel like it just doesn't do good on the YouTube algo. So I haven't been recording many of these videos. But in general, just any AP board, you can just play around Black Rose. But I'm probably going to cut... I don't know if you guys want to see gameplay. Please let me know in the comment section if you want gameplay. Because I think, according to the view statistics, this is usually where people click off of the video anyways. So I think I'm going to cut the example gameplay from these guides and maybe do example gameplay as a separate video for those people that really want it. But what I would recommend is just look through my channel. Any game that I play Dominators or Silco, which there are a couple of them, you can find, and I'll explain it thoroughly through those. But thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. Next up, I'm going to do a Rebel guide. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it tomorrow or the day after. I want to do a general rank up guide. But I do want to get a little bit of a better understanding of the patch. I've been getting frustrated on stream playing this patch because I hate 6 costs, but that's just a me thing. So before I do my general rank up guide, I just want to have like a little bit more of a knowledgeable stance on the current patch and stuff like that. But I want to do a general rank up guide as well as like some easy to climb comps with that you guys can try out and play a bunch. This will be one of those comps, by the way. So if you're looking for something that's easy to climb with, that you want to just like be able to say, okay, I want to like play the same comp multiple times. This is something that's very open-ended and I recommend it a lot. However, like, you know, of course, if you're not somebody who's into 4 costs and you don't like that whole stressful flex play, it might not be for you. But this is one of my go-tos. Like, if I don't know what I'm playing towards, I usually end up trying to play towards Silco. But thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. And yeah, if you want to see more example gameplay in these type of videos, also let me know in the comment section. Because like I said, a lot of people just like click off of it. So I'm just trying to adjust I'm trying to adjust my stuff, like my videos, so that it fits what the people want more. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.